So first of all, we want to say thank you to Sarah Nelson, Tanya Hunt, Betsy Lundy, and Namrata Baswani, because you provided us with data, insights, and context that help our project. So thank you so much for your time and support. So science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM, grows national economic. In 2023, STEM occupations contribute to 39% of the US gross domestic product. And specifically in Iowa, the annual growth rate for 2022 to 2032 is around 0.6. However, for STEM-related occupations, we have an estimated growth of 1.28. And additionally, STEM businesses in Iowa grow at a higher rate than non-STEM businesses, as we can see in this map, where Iowa is one of the few states where the difference between STEM and non-STEM job creation is positive towards STEM. So these are some of the indicators that show why STEM is so important to the US and for Iowa. However, the governor of Iowa noticed that many companies struggle to find qualified workers. And in response, the state has introduced several initiatives like Scale Up, BEST, and Teacher Externship programs that aim to engage students and teachers into STEM. So our motivation for this project is to understand what the STEM resources Iowa has and where these STEM resources are located. And more specifically, to answer the following research questions. Which STEM workforce resources already exist in Iowa, both those in active use and those that remain on tape? Where are these resources located and how they can be used to support entrepreneurship in STEM? What are the factors impacting Iowa STEM education? And finally, what is the relationship between education and the workforce in Iowa? Now, what is STEM? And this was the first big obstacle our team faced because several US institutions manage different classification systems for what STEM is. For instance, the US Department of Labor uses the ONET occupation codes, while the US Census Bureau uses the North American Industry Classification System, and the Department of Homeland Security uses the classification of instructional programs. So the way we solve this, we look for crosswalks between the CIP codes and the OCC codes, and also we manually classify each industry and sub-industry as STEM or non-STEM related. And now we are going to show you our approach for the project.
So before we actually take you through all the things we ended up finding, I did it anyway. Before we take you through everything we ended up finding, we wanted to actually show you how we found it and the approach we took throughout the program. Because when we started out at the first week, we only had a vague idea of what we actually wanted to pursue in looking towards STEM. And so we started with trying to decide what the value of STEM actually is and the status of it in Iowa. And that took us into two different directions. We wanted to look at education aspect of STEM and also the workforce and industry of STEM. In education, we decided to start with... Okay. Okay. When we looked at education, we started with the beginning of a STEM professional's life, which is in K through 12. And that took us looking at the various Iowa schools and which ones were doing well, which ones were doing bad, and what in general we can improve in Iowa. We also ended up looking at some research papers, and later we'll show you an influence diagram that we compiled out of that. That took us into colleges and universities, which is where we go from after K through 12. And how many degrees conferred are actually in STEM nationwide in Iowa, et cetera, and kind of look at what the status of STEM in that aspect is. After students graduate from colleges and universities, they often go into the workforce and industry. And so we looked at those actual potential employees and the employers that would employ them into STEM jobs. And that took us into creating a resource map, which we'll show you later, that gives us many different outcomes in looking at where employers are and where potential gaps are as well. And then also, by the end of this program, we ended up compiling so many data sets regarding to STEM education in Iowa. And the last thing we'll show you is the comprehensive database that we created that we hope can fuel further projects in the future. So we started with K through 12, and to try to get a big look at the general state of STEM education in Iowa, we started on the larger scale and then started moving into smaller and smaller scale until we looked at individual schools. But when we needed to look at the entire state as a whole, we still wanted to have some regions we were looking at. And that led us to the Iowa Area Education Agencies. These agencies are a product of Iowa's history when a lot of our counties were joining together and starting to manage their school districts in groups. And until the point in which we noticed that, or Iowa noticed that different areas and these different jointed county groups were having different resources allocated to them, and some areas were falling behind while others were ahead. So the area education agencies were created to try to have a more even spread of these resources and have a better standard of what we give our K through 12 schools, which made it the perfect thing to look at because this is a factor where we have a lot of things that are similar across these regions, but we can still try to look at those differences and see any significant insights.
Now, before we get started looking at STEM education in Iowa, we wanted to figure out what is the general state of education in Iowa, maybe in hopes that this could give us some insights into what is going on in STEM in Iowa. So to do so, we used information from the Iowa Schools Performance Profiles, or the ISPP report, which is essentially a report that shows the performance of public schools per year. Using this information, we built this interactive map that shows the number of schools transitioning per region from an average category or above to a needing help or priority status. So these categories such as average, needing help, priority, and etc. are created using 6 factors: math and science performance, student growth, graduation rates, college readiness, attendance, and English language development. One observation we can make from this map is that this region in specific, here, the Harlan AEE, has the most amount of transitions in elementary schools, in middle schools, as well as high schools. So although we didn't explore much into why this region is suffering way more than its peers, we did hypothesize that this could be due to a decrease in legislative funding. But overall, from these 3 maps, it seems that Iowa is declining in education as over 350 total schools across elementary, middle, and high school have experienced some decline in education status. Since a part of the status is math and science proficiency scores, this gives us an insight on how STEM education is essentially performing in Iowa. To further explore more into STEM education, we decided to compare Iowa with some of the Midwestern states using the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or the NAEP test. Using the NAEP scores that was provided by the National Center of Educational Statistics, we were able to map the change in fourth grade and eighth grade NAEP math scores from 2022 to 2024. So this map shows us the percentage change in fourth grade NAEP math scores, and this map shows us the percentage change in eighth grade NAEP math scores. One observation we can make out of the gate is that Iowa seems to have a negative growth rate in percentage change in both eighth grade and AP math scores, as well as fourth grade and AP math scores. In contrast, there are some states around the Midwest that seem to be performing very well. For example, Indiana and Ohio, which both have a positive percentage change in fourth grade and eighth grade NAP scores. This raises the question, what are these states doing that is helping them improve their NAEP math scores and math scores in general? So what we decided to look into next was maybe some of the strategies or policies that these states have that could improve math scores in Iowa, and it could also be able to, Iowa could potentially be able to implement these as well. So two of the states we picked was Indiana and Ohio, and Indiana in specific has this program for K through 12 robotics grants, and this is essentially dedicated funding for hands-on robotics and coding, and this is up to $100K in total funding. And we looked at Iowa, and Iowa does have the best program, which partners local industries with schools, and some of these partnerships do involve robots and drones. But we did find that Iowa doesn't really have a specific funding just for robotics. So maybe we hope that maybe this could be implemented soon in Iowa. Ohio also has a program called the Ohio STEM Learning Network Classroom Grants, which awards up to $5,000 per teacher for STEM innovation. So far, Ohio has been able to fund over 300 projects. And when we looked at Iowa in specific, Iowa does have STEM initiatives such as these, but these are more towards schools. And Iowa doesn't really offer a classroom-specific grant that teachers are able to use so that they can work around flexibly with the funds. Now, looking at these policies can help improve some of the STEM initiatives, but maybe we need to dive deeper into the situation in Iowa and look at the regional differences and find some specific regions, or even some specific grade levels that are suffering so that we can try to focus on these grade levels or regions. So to do so, we looked at the Iowa statewide assessment of student progress, or the ISASP, which was acquired from the ISPP report. And looking at this report, we compared the percentage of students proficient in each grade level at math and science. So when looking at these maps, there doesn't really seem to be a region that is consistently underperforming. So for example, here we see that there are 3 regions that are darker in color, which means a lower proficiency rate. But there doesn't seem to be a singled out region that is essentially suffering, underperforming. And this is similar in the case of 8th grade math proficiency, 10th grade math proficiency, as well as science in 5th grade, 8th grade, and 10th grade. We did notice that when we compared 5th grade math proficiency to 5th grade science proficiency, 5th grade science proficiency is much darker in color, which means worse in proficiency rates than 5th grade math proficiency rates. So one of the reasons we hypothesized was that maybe this could be this was like a starting point where science begins to expand, broaden, and there's a lot more science topics now, for example, geography and social sciences and such, that it's hard to encompass one science compared to math, which is more general. But this is just a hypothesis we created. This is if we really need to look at what are the causes, we need to explore it further. But looking at the regions, there doesn't seem to be a singled out region that is underperforming. But when we've moved our focus to grade levels, we see that 10th grade math and science proficiency scores rates are much lower compared to 5th and 8th grades. Now, to look at why, this might be the reason, maybe we had to look further into the regional differences and explore each school and try to figure out what are these schools doing essentially that is helping them, that is causing lower classes, and maybe compare them to the schools that are doing really well and try to look at maybe what essentially is going on. And when so in this case, we also decided to switch our focus from ISASP scores to ACT scores, because ACT scores help give us a better perspective in terms of future comparisons to other states and other school districts in other states, as well as schools. And it also is helpful when we measure college readiness. And research has also shown that ISASP scores and ACT scores are correlated. So extrapolating from ISASP to ACT is not a big stretch. It's not a far stretch. Now, using the data from the ISPP, we created this map that illustrates the percentage of students meeting ACT benchmark per school. So the ACT national-wide benchmark for math is 21 out of 36, and for science, it's 23 out of 36. One notable observation we can make out of this map is that there only exists one school that is in the 75% to 100% of the percentage of students meeting ACT math benchmarks. This school over here is South Winnipeg Community High School. And when we switch over to ACT Science, it's also the same school that is in that category. So we hypothesized that maybe this could be because of such a low amount of students taking the ACT scores in the school. So it was actually 13 people taking ACT ACT in this school. So it could be due to that. And when we compare it to, for example, one of these schools, which is East High School, there's 10%, but of those 10%, there's 58 people actually taking the school test. So it could be that it's due to the amount of students. But then when we specifically looked at that student range of 11 to 15 students taking ACT, we found that South Winnipeg High School actually outperforms the next highest school by around 30% in the percentage of students above the benchmark. So this basically helps us identify that, even though it could be due to a student, the low amount of student taking ACT, it is still important to highlight this and explore some of the maybe initiatives that the school is doing regarding teaching methods and curriculum that could help. Now, another observation we can make from this map is that we can see clusters of areas where there's a lot of red and in the below 50% category. So for example, we can see a cluster forming essentially right here. We can see a cluster forming here. We can see a cluster forming here as well as here. To highlight more, to highlight more of these clusters, we decided to use a heat map. And using this heat map, we can see that most of these clusters occur in urban areas. For example, we see a big cluster in Des Moines, as well as Cedar Rapids and Davenport. There are small clusters over here, but it isn't as significant as the ones that are in urban areas. Now, this could be due to the fact that urban areas have a lot more schools in the area, but it is still important to figure out a question: what is the difference maybe that rural schools in this area are doing compared to the ones in urban areas in terms of improving their STEM proficiency? We hypothesized that there could be two reasons. There are obviously more, but the ones we narrowed down to were two, which were funding and student ratio. To explore this question further, we tried to compare the average funding and student to teacher ratios between rural and urban areas. But this is when we encountered a roadblock. So the available data we have on funding and student to teacher ratio is in district level, and it isn't available to us in individual school level. So determining whether school level really exists, school level data really exists, will require additional research. But this presents an opportunity for future work to investigate, what are the factors, if any, if one of these are factors that contribute to rural schools outperforming urban counterparts in STEM. But overall, we see that ISASP scores and ACT scores are on an overall decline. As you can see, there's a lot more red in this map than there is blue, as well as in science. Now, one of the reasons we hypothesize this could be is due to interest level, student interest. And when we look at student interest, when we look at this graph, this is a graph for the student interest over time by STEM fields in Iowa from 2013 to 2021 for K through 12. And when we look at this graph, we see that for the math field, the very interested level of student interest is increasing rapidly from 2017 and on, while the not interested category is increasingly rapid. And although this isn't obvious in the science section, we do see that there is a slight increase in the not interested category in science. Now, the student interest could be a factor, but there are obviously multiple other factors that contribute to this decline. And many of these are actually in our database. But analyzing these variables will take a significant amount of time and effort because of how complex and the amount of data we actually have. But that being said, the findings point to opportunities for improvement and growth and strengthening the development in Iowa's emerging STEM workforce. Now that we have explored the state of STEM education at K through 12 level, the next question is, what is the current status of STEM at the college level?
So we'll show you later about how many people are going into post-secondary education after finishing K through 12. And because of that, we needed to look at the STEM degrees in universities as a factor of STEM in Iowa. And just like before with K through 12, we wanted to look at a very broad scope and then sort of zero in on more things into a smaller area. And we started with the national data set for the number of STEM degrees conferred by level per year. And so in 2020, 437,000 degrees of STEM were actually in bachelor's, which is almost 3 times as much as master's. And in general, bachelor's degrees in STEM are growing much faster than any of the other ones. However, that isn't necessarily surprising to us. What we wanted to look at is sort of the other levels of degrees. And what we can see here is that master's has actually grown also, especially in the time period between 2013 and 2016 more rapidly. On top of that, we were surprised to see that associate's degrees were on the decline, whereas less than associate's degrees, which is oftentimes certificates and other sort of not 2-year programs, are rising. And one potential idea we had that came from this finding is that potentially STEM has an increasingly competitive workforce. And so people are trying to stand out and break into niches, in which case a certificate or master's might help them do that. However, this would provide an opportunity for further analysis, and we can't conclude that, but it's something to keep in mind. However, the thing that's consistent across all the years is that the number of STEM degrees at the doctorate level is not growing, and it remains really unpopular. But that's the national data. We needed to actually look at the situation in Iowa, which brought us to this data set from the University of Kansas about the percentage of degrees conferred in science and engineering per state in a certain year. And so this map shows you the percent change between 2017 and 2022 in those states. As you can see here, Iowa is actually performing pretty well on this metric. It has a 3.2% increase since 2017, and in 2022 has a 35.3% of degrees in science and engineering conferred. Whereas Michigan is the only one that grew at a higher rate, which was by 3.4%. And so naturally, there are two sort of doubts you might have when looking at this data most initially. One of those is that Iowa maybe just didn't have a high percentage of degrees conferred in STEM to start with, so showing growth would be pretty easy, right? Well, that's also not true because in 2022, Iowa was in the top 3 of states of having the highest percentage of all degrees conferred in science and engineering. Wisconsin was at 38.2%, but it didn't grow as much as Michigan, which is at 38.1% in 2022. And Iowa is just behind those at 35.3% in 2022. The other sort of doubt that we might have initially is that, well, science and engineering includes our agricultural sciences. And of course, Iowa's very good at agricultural sciences. We have all that corn that's sweating right now. But we actually looked at the US News and World Report, which is the common ranking system for global university programs, and saw that yes, Iowa has a university, our very own Iowa State, in the top 10 for agricultural sciences globally, but other Midwest states also have very high performing universities in agricultural science. Above Iowa State University, we're actually Purdue University from Indiana and Michigan State University in Michigan. And immediately following Iowa State University were universities from Wisconsin, Illinois, Ohio, Minnesota. So because of that, we kind of might think that agricultural sciences aren't the only ones pulling the way on Iowa performing well in STEM degrees, and that actually we have a large percentage of our degrees conferred in science and engineering. Now, the other idea that we have from here is that maybe Iowa doesn't have as many non-STEM programs. However, that kind of goes outside of the scope of our research within these 9 weeks and would require further analysis. But because of all of this we saw, which is that Iowa is performing pretty well in STEM for post-secondary education, we wanted to think about what happens once those students graduate, and also what happens to the students who didn't choose to pursue post-secondary education at all.
So before moving to workforce, let us take a look at the high school students and their intentions of what they want to do after graduating. We see that about 25% of the students, over 25% of the students tend to go to community colleges from which they may transfer to one of the four-year universities. And same as before, over 25% of the people intend to go to public universities, and about 10% of them go to private universities, making up to about like 60% of the people pursuing higher secondary education. And we see that about 20% of the people actually go into employment right after high school, which is quite a large number. And the others go into military and some other trainings. Looking at such a high number of people going into employment right after high school, we see, looking at the STEM workers, we see from the study from the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics that a little over half of these STEM workers do not actually have a bachelor's degree, and they do not need one. So we wanted to look into what is the point of our bachelor's degree and up to what extent is it useful. So we analyze certain factors such as age, lifestyle, but one of the main factors we want to look at are wages. So we looked at the wages for people from Iowa who have a bachelor's degree in STEM, which are represented by these orange bars, and the ones without a bachelor's working in STEM represented by these green bars. So what we found is to earn up to 75K per year, there's the people without bachelor's degrees working in STEM exceeding the people with bachelor's. And we find that after to earn over 75 or 100K, there's still a substantial amount of people having no bachelor's degrees earning that amount, but the people with the degrees increases. We see similar trends with non-STEM workforce, where about you could earn up to about 50K without a bachelor's, but to earn more than that, a bachelor's degree is needed. We also found something in common from both of them is that you could earn a livable wage of up to like 50 to 75K in both the cases, but to earn more than that or to develop more in your job or to earn more, a bachelor's degree is useful. Another thing we found comparing STEM versus non-STEM is that STEM workers tend to earn higher incomes than non-STEM workers, especially for these people earning over 75K. We see that the people working in STEM without bachelor's degrees is a lot higher than people working in non-STEM even with the bachelor's degrees. Keeping that in mind, we wanted to look at the net job creation for all of these people, comparing Iowa with other Midwestern states as well as all the other states in America. So we looked at a few things like number of new firms created, job creation, job destruction, and so on. So looking at the net job creation over the past few years in STEM fields, we see that states like California, Texas, Florida have a very high net job creation rate, which is pretty common due to them being major tech hubs. And looking at the Midwestern states compared to Iowa, Iowa's doing pretty good. It's doing average as compared to the other states. We see a lot of job creation in states like Minnesota and Illinois and so on. Comparing Iowa with one of the Midwestern states to see its development in the STEM job creation, we see that Minnesota is performing better currently, but over the span of time, we see points like in the years 2018 and 2020 where Iowa is on par with Minnesota, and a few years where it's exceeded in the job creation as compared to Minnesota. Another thing we might notice is that the STEM job creation is about 10 to 20K, and it is increasing pretty rapidly over the time. It has a pretty good growth rate as compared to non-STEM, where the job creation is pretty high, but we see for Iowa it's pretty stagnant and not much growth as compared to STEM fields. So kind of moving on from that, we wanted to look at one of the major problems Iowa is facing about STEM migration. So we know that Iowa currently has a population of about 3.2 million people, out of which 1.3 million of them are actually born in Iowa and are working in STEM fields. And out of that 1.3 million, over the span of time, we've seen that 700,000 of them no longer reside in Iowa, and they're migrating to nearby states, nearby Midwestern states, like Minnesota, having the highest migration of about like 36K people, and Illinois being the second highest with 32K, and other Midwestern states, as well as states like California and Texas. One of the main questions could be, why is all of the STEM talent leaving Iowa? Like we've seen in the job creation map before, one of the main reasons could be employment. People are migrating in search for better job opportunities and so on. But we look at it more as a potential opportunity than a challenge. since Iowa already has a very skilled workforce, available land, strong education, and designated opportunity zones, which we'll talk about more in the resource map coming up. We believe that with the right investments and policies, we have the potential not just to retain all of this talent, but to become a hub for STEM innovation and growth.
We'd prefer if you hold the question. Yeah, so we're approaching the end of our presentation with the final deliverables, which we have three main ones, which is an influence diagram, a map of Iowa showing STEM resources available, and the database that I mentioned earlier. And first, I'd like to tell you about the influence diagram we have, which is a non-data deliverable, but it is based off of three scholarly studies that use the structural equation modeling and path analysis to kind of project the factors that influence student interest in STEM. And as you might remember from earlier in the presentation, we saw student interest in math and science going down in that K through 12 area. And also we see that people are sort of leaving Iowa and whatnot. But what originally inspired this after we saw that STEM interest going down is the study we found from the Philippines, which actually had weights to these different factors to see which ones influenced more than others. We could not implement that for the state of Iowa because that would require a lot more research and surveying and a whole extra process that could not fit within 9 weeks. But we wanted to highlight that some of the most important factors in the other studies were impact of the teacher and student self-efficacy, which might or may not correlate with student academic achievement. So self-efficacy is defined essentially as a student's self-perception of their potential and skill, and sort of influences whether they choose a STEM career because, well, it makes some sense because if a student does not believe they are good at math, they might not want to go into a STEM major because it's in the name. And me personally, I would also have a lot of reservations about trying to go into something I think I'm bad at. And so we want to focus on having these factors as a potential area of improvement for Iowa, and that this is a very great potential for us to continue exploring because it can actually help change our situation, especially right now as post-secondary education levels are at a mismatch with K through 12. And we want this to be a sustainable improvement, which is why we also ended up looking a lot into the resources for workforce and industry following that, since many students are going to want to pick a career that is sustainable for them.
So looking at the STEM resource map, which is one of our products, this map actually answers the first two of our research questions, which is what are the STEM resources that are available in Iowa and where they're located. And we combined all of the resources we found and worked with four major factors: potential workforce, opportunity zones, universities, and institutes, and STEM employers. Looking at them one by one, starting with the potential workforce, these are all of the people in Iowa that are unemployed, as well as the STEM attrition. STEM attrition is all of the people who have a bachelor's degree in one of the STEM fields, but are currently working in non-STEM fields. So this data is categorized in Puma tracts, and we have potential workforce of about, let's say, 13K in this Polk and Dallas County Puma tract. On top of which, we added the opportunity zones, which were designed by the IRS in 2018. And they are the economically struggling areas, and the goal behind is to set policies and tax incentives, such as lower taxes and such, in the hope to improve the areas economically and motivating businesses and industries to set them up in those areas. Major chunks of opportunity zones we can find are in the South, in Decatur County, Davis County, sorry, and a few here. Over which we also added universities and institutions, categorized by type, whether they're community colleges, public or private universities. And lastly, we also added the STEM employers in the state of Iowa, and we filtered them to be only STEM and categorized them by sector. For example, if we look at the manufacturing sector, these are all of the companies or industries in Iowa whose sector is manufacturing. And one of the examples we see if you look at Jackson County is Collins Aerospace, which is known to be a very famous manufacturing sector. It has employees of about 100 to 300 people, and it was established in 1988. The size of the circles, the employers, it represents how big the company is and how many employees there are working in it. So it can range from about 50 to 100 people and 500 or more. So getting to the uses of this resource map, one of the main uses would be to find clusters of these resources, such as if you look at this example in the Des Moines City Puma Tract, we have a potential workforce of about 9,000 people. We have an opportunity zone right here. We have universities and institutes in less than a 5-mile radius. And if you were a manufacturing industry looking to set up your company someplace, this would be an ideal location with all of the resources, as well as if you look nearby, there aren't as many big manufacturing industries. Another potential use of this map would be to support strategic collaboration between educational institutes and universities we've seen and companies to ensure the workforce training and aligns with their industry needs.
Our third and last deliverable that we looked at was the STEM data source. So when we started this project, we first thought that we would struggle with finding enough data in regarding STEM education or STEM workforce. But when we continued researching, we found that it was actually quite the opposite, and there was actually a lot more data than we imagined there would be. But the problem with this is that a lot of this data is scattered in multiple different sources. So if I wanted to compare a variable from one source that had to connect with another variable in another source with the same school, it would be difficult since I would have to compare, I would have to match this table with this table, and it would be a lot more tedious and time consuming, and it would be tougher for analysis. So to solve this, what we did was we created a SQL database that connects all of these data sources that we have worked with and relates all the tables that we have, tables essentially, or sources, by either school codes, area codes, or district level codes. And we essentially created two data sources, one was education, which connects all these different value sources with district codes, area codes, and school codes. We also created an industry data source which has information on employees per industry, size class, the occupation growth rates, etc. And we match these using growth, occupation, area, geography. So we hope that with this deliverable, that future groups don't have to spend too much time on just finding and analyzing just finding the amount of data, and instead they can focus more on the qualitative analysis.
So as a conclusion, we see a really big contrast in Iowa. At one hand, we have good projections for STEM occupations for the next 8 years. Also, we have a lot of potential workforce. But on the other hand, we have a declining situation in the K to 12 students. So the problem is, if these trends continue, some STEM-related industry might be forced to move outside of Iowa to find those qualified professionals. And consequently, Iowa, the field of opportunities, could also experience a high levels of migration from those STEM professionals who will not be able to find those opportunities here. So thank you so much. This was our presentation. Now we are open to question and answer.